I am talking about something completely different than what I had planned at the beginning of the week. Um, that might fit better with the themes of this conference. So for me, it feels a little old because this is about work that I've been doing with Lev and Justin Hilburn, Alexia Blomkov, and my former student Nick Garner, and it's things we did mainly before the pandemic, and then we sat on a draft throughout the pandemic, and the paper hasn't come out yet, so it's still work in progress.
The rest of us.
Yes. With any luck, the paper will come out in the coming week or so. So we actually have a chance to finish it up. So the conference is about Dahas and Coulomb branches, and my talk is about that. Mainly putting those concepts and not homology in a physical setup in three-dimensional topological field theory. So I wanted to start by drawing some pictures. This talk is going to have a bunch of pictures. The sort of not homology I'll be discussing is Humphrey homology. So this is triply graded. There's I call in A grading. Other people do too. This is the extra grading in the Humphrey polynomial, and then there's sort of a Q grading, which is the quantum thing that exists even in Jones polynomials, and there's a homological grading. Humphrey homology started in physics, was predicted to exist in a paper of Gukov and Schwartz and work of Benfeld, Gukov and Rasmussen, and then defined by Kavanagh and Rosansky. The initial physical setup that predicted that this ought to exist involved M theory on the conifold and passing through a so-called conifold transition from a deformed to a resolved conifold. And one ends up with the following schematic picture. Setup is M theory on I'm calling the resolved conifold is the total space of two O minus 1s over P1, and this times nut times time to make up 11 dimensions. Most of the interesting geometry is happening in this resolved conifold, and the setup that should have something to do with Humphrey homology is the following. It's a toric diagram of the conifold. So the information about a knot is encoded in a Lagrangian cycle that I realize that's a little much better. That in words is it's the normal of a knot in S3 on the deformed conifold side that's been pulled through. So-called conifold transition. The only thing I want to say here is that there's a Lagrangian whose geometry is determined by a knot.
Can you remind what's Tn?
Taub knot space. The Coulomb branch of C mod C star. Algebraically, it's T star C. Taub net is a deformation of the metric on that.
What's the dimension of this LK?
3. So it's a Lagrangian in a 6-dimensional, and it's 3 real dimensional and a set of 6 real dimensional. The information about the A grading sorry, and there are physics words involved. So there are M5 branes wrapped on. There's an M5 brane wrapped on this thing, and some directions in T star C times R. But anyway, in the conifold Lagrangian 3 cycle, and then there's a holomorphic real 2-dimensional cycle, the P1 in the conifold, sorry, the reason I'm saying all this is because I'm about to relate it to 3D mirror gauge theories in 3 dimensions. And I just want to explain where the ingredients are coming from. So for A to the K degree in Humphrey homology, the physical setup says to put K M2 branes on this P1. And finally, where is the homology coming from itself? That's another holomorphic cycle. So they're holomorphic disks that it's sort of like that. So also M2s. And these are holomorphic disks ending on the knot Lagrangian, and interacting with these other M2 branes on the P1. The A to the K part of Humphrey homology is supposed to come from the Hilbert space, the K or the kth row. Humphrey homology. Is supposed to be the BPS Hilbert space, or the way I'll describe it, it's the Hilbert space in a certain topological twist. Of these M2 branes on a disk, and M2 branes are 3-dimensional object, so their extent is really disk times time. These various branes are doing something in taubnet times R. Here it's that times R, and that looks like a 3-dimensional theory. It's this times R comes with a state space, and that state space is supposed to be a particular row of Humphrey homology.
What does K m to the right hand side?
Perfect. There's a defect passing through the center of the disk, which is where the two touch. That ought to be labeled by some integer K. And there is a boundary condition on the disk that had better contain the information of a knot. Sort of the outer boundary here. Okay, so right, so with the folks I mentioned earlier, we analyzed to motivate our field theory configurations, we analyzed a particular limit of the setup in which the knot starts out as Lev calls it, the closure of a tight braid. So we took A to be a braid closure that is, and realize these are just words, but where there are a bunch of strands very, very close together, sitting along roughly one big circle. And a good way to think of this is as a multi-cover of a circle. That picture makes sense when you're trying to include it geometrically into a conifold and look at its conormal and pass it through a geometric transition. If the knot sort of looks like this, this Lagrangian LK becomes, well, so if there are n strands in the braid, the Lagrangian LK looks like an n cover, or a deformation of n copies of S1 times R2. And these M2s here look like, if their end is going all the way around n times, these M2s here look like an n cover, an n-fold cover of a disk. So then one expects to get like a rank n field theory on the M2s to try to analyze this state space. Now, one learns in physics that to get gauge theories on brains, one should not work in M theory, but sort of reduce to type 2 string theory instead. That involves reducing this picture on a circle, or express, maybe a better way to say it, what one needs in order to identify a field theory here is to express this conifold times tau nut times R geometry as a circle fibration. And it may be a degenerate circle fibration, and those circles may shrink, and that it was worked out in the 90s how to analyze that. But so the nice thing here is that there are two ways to express this as a circle fibration.
Can I perhaps ask a question about the configuration of M2 braid? So in the population string picture, if you think about is the brain being labeled by some representation, by some Young diagram, what would this correspond to?
It's a single row in that setup.
Is that what?
That's because it's not colored humbly. So in the topological string setup, you get all representations in like the Jones polynomial. And that's a generalization that we can include and that has been studied. But just or Homsley, it's or rather, I think the easier thing to say is that it's just it's a single brain. And so in the case, if we just had an unknot, this is what's called an Aganagich-Waffe brain. So they studied these geometries, and it's just a single one, a single disk, ending on something that is S1 times R2. Sorry, the Aganagich-Waffe brain is the S1 times R2. And so what I'm describing here is a multi-cover of that scenario.
That's another question. The K, the integer K, the picture that you explained about this M2 wrapping around n times.
Yeah.
I guess that would introduce a defect like order n orbifold defect at the origin. The relation between K and
it wouldn't. It doesn't. It's not necessarily at the origin. There could be many branch points in various places, and that's that'll be a dynamical feature.
That's not related to
There no, so it won't be this defect. The fields in the theory will be n by n matrices, and will in solving the equations of motion, those will give us some sort of spectral cover, and dynamically a branched covering will pop out.
So as you said, this diagram is happening in 6-dimensional symplectic manifold, or?
Yes, I mean it's six-dimensional times 5, but this diagram is six real dimensions.
What's the topology of this manifold?
The manifold is the total space of that. And so it's got a P1, and logically just contracts onto. Okay. So the vibration that gives rise to the maybe easier to analyze field theory is a weird vibration. It expresses the conifold. As a vibration over R5. In the circle that we're using here, and I don't think more colors are going to be useful. But there's so in this vibration, the circle that we're reducing on sort of is the circle in the fiber as so above each point of P1, there's a C times C fiber on roughly the North Pole. The disk M2s sit very close to one of these C fibers, and we're reducing along the other one. And around the P1 and around this leg. This gives rise to a three-dimensional B model, or the B twist of a 3D gauge theory. And there's another vibration which is in the Taub knot. So it's expressing Taub knot as a vibration over R3. And by lots of work in the 90s, when so in both the M2 brains become D2 brains upon reduction on the circle. They're still three-dimensional, and one learns that such reductions give you 3D mirror gauge theories on the D2 brains that result. There's a local model of this that some of you may have seen or encountered. That might be worth reminding us of. So if we start with M theory on a product of tau nut spaces that are multi-centered, with the M2 brane, with M2 brane sitting on R3 and a point on those sorts of singularities, then compactifying on one circle gives rise to a 3D theory whose Higgs branch, there are two circles here, A and B. We will get a 3D theory whose Higgs branch looks like we get another D instantons D GL and instantons on at K, or vice versa. This Coulomb branch is the GL K instant. That N. Or if we swap circles and reduce, then we get the opposite thing. And what's happening here is in some sense a very, very simple version of that, where N and K are one, and what I call D here is N there. So what theories do we get there? Talking too much. So the B reduction lands us in both 3D n equals 4. Gauge theories lands us in a theory with gauge group GLN and representation star V with adjoint times fundamental. There's the quiver associated. The quiver associated to this looks like that. The Higgs and Coulomb branches we resolve become Hilbert schemes. If we don't resolve the Higgs and Coulomb branches are symmetric products. I guess I've already drawn the cylinder once. The cylinder always looks the same. It's just how we describe the objects in it that changes. And in the A twist, sorry, in the A reduction, it's exactly the same theory. This one is self-mirror. What changes is that there's a topological B twist on that side, and there's a topological A twist. On this side, so here it's the Higgs branch that's going to be important, and here it's the Coulomb branch that's going to be important. And these are related by 3D mirror symmetry. Now,
Tudor, how should I think about the relationship of these circle vibrations to the mirror symmetry on the 3D guy, right? Somehow from the 3D perspective, I would have said, oh, I have the supersymmetry algebra and I have two twists in it, the two factors and spin 4.
Yeah.
It's just like, is this just a weird coincidence?
No. So first you can ask what happens to the R symmetries. I think that's how you see that it's mirror symmetry. So the R 3D mirror symmetry swaps the two SU2 actions, swaps the role, and the two SU2 actions are geometric in the directions that transverse to the M2 brane. And I guess that's the start of it. So yeah, one can argue directly from the geometry that mirror symmetry should be what's happening. And this isn't just 3D mirror symmetry and 2D mirror symmetry and what Bensy is telling me to now call 4D mirror symmetry, otherwise known as S-duality, happen the same way. In physics, they come from swapping orders of circle compactor deviations. Great. So this side, this cylinder, if analyzed carefully using well-known techniques by now, or well-developed techniques, leads us to the Oblomkov-Rosansky construction. Of Humphrey homology involving matrix factorizations and sheaves on a Hilbert scheme. And yes, coherent sheaves. C2, and this is the Higgs branch. So I can say lots about this, but it ultimately is like what I would say is how to use some brain constructions to just recover all the data that Levin and Alexei had set up. The sort of more interesting part of this maybe is the A side. And what I'll try to say a bit in the next 20-ish minutes is that for algebraic knots and for algebraic lengths, you get a slight generalization that ends up being equivalent to affine Springer fiber constructions. So we find that this Hilbert space can be expressed as homology of some affine Springer fiber. And connects to work of Gursky, Oblomkov, Rasmussen, and Shende on this picture. The part that I initially and still find very exciting about the A-twist is that, like in principle, the setup tells us how to work with non-algebraic links as well. There things that ought to come out is a representation of the braid group in a 2 category, and that on one hand would tell us, taking appropriate traces, how to get the space. Also, there's a description in terms of homology of some moduli space of solutions to differential equations that seems to be there for non-algebraic lengths. I can write down guesses for both of those physically, though they've been very difficult to analyze sensibly mathematically. So that this is hopefully a thing we'll be able to say more about in the future.
Is a affine Springer fiber, so it's GLN, so to say.
Yeah, they're generalized affine Springer fibers. I'll define it a little later. It's in the sense of Joel and Alex and Justin's generalized affine Springer theory. Okay. So let me talk about some ingredients here. So first on the two sides, I mentioned topological twists. We haven't really talked about 3D TQFT in this conference. I will use that language and let you all infer what 3D TQFT is supposed to look like. There are two TQFT functors, one on each side. No, predicted again. That are called ZB and ZA. ZB of a two sphere is physically known as local operators in the 2DB model. I think of this big cylinder, things at points. There's a vector space of what you can attach to a point. Physically and mathematically in TQFT formalism, it's the space on the length of that point, which is S2. And this is functions on, you actually compute it, what you get is functions on the symplectic quotient of T star V mod by G, which is functions on the Higgs branch. And on the K side, A of S2 is of course the same thing, but it shows up as functions on the Coulomb branch, and the way you would actually compute it with some clever manipulation lands you on the BFN construction. So it's the natural way that ZA of S2 arises here is the BFN construction. It's homology. That's the space of maps from two formal disks glued over a punctured disk. That's S2. To the mod. One they say functions on the bench. Right. The next step in TQFT, which is really central to the not homology constructions, is Z of S1.
Sorry, when I tried to look at maps from P1 to
As a vector space, you can do both. But seeing the algebra structure, the problem here, it's not really a problem, but to compute anything, you want to make the problem algebraic. And if like physically, it doesn't actually matter that this thing is complex or not. And you can talk about solutions to differential equations, which are some sort of monopole equations, and try to figure out how to relate a quantization of spaces of solutions to these monopole-like equations on two spheres sitting inside a bigger sphere to get an algebra structure. I don't think anyone has really done that. We talked about it a bit in an old paper with Justin and Davide and Matt Bollimore. Instead, what's nice about this holomorphic structure is that there's a nice convolution product. It's very easy to embed ravioli inside bigger ravioli, and the product from convolution is nice. That's why there should absolutely be a way to just use S2. CFS1 is what we call the category of line operators. The expectation is that this is a braided tensor category. The braided tensor bit is not relevant at all for the not homology construction, but it's interesting in general and what I would have talked about in the other talk. This Z of S1 is where the blue defects sit. So S1 is the length of the line. That's the S1. So the things that we can put on a one-dimensional defect in the 3D theory are the objects of this category Z of S1. And so in particular, things labeled by integer k, a degree, it should sit here. Or in the B-twist, this by old work of Kapustin, Rozansky, Salina, sort of generalized a bit into a gauge theory context. This category can be expressed as matrix factorizations on G times T star V, G equivariant matrix factorizations, G times T star V, with some superpotential that's a contraction of G minus 1 and the moment map. If we impose stability, and that is also an important part of the knot homology construction, to get Hilbert scheme rather than symmetric product, one imposes stability. And that doesn't appear at the level of functions, it certainly appears at the level of the category of lines.
What's small g here?
It's an element, it's a coordinate on the group. It's a function of the group. And the moment map is the function on T star V. Imposing stability cuts out a locus in T star V, and ends up trivializing this condition because the only way to looking at the critical locus of W on the stable part, it just becomes smooth. And this becomes coherent sheaves on the Higgs branch.
Sorry, but you wrote an equation without stability.
I just added it.
The first equality is true with this stability parameter or without?
So the entire TQFT has a gigantic space of deformations. And so and I'm being very loose about them because feeling a full discussion is horrible. There, right, so here.
Pass from symmetric factorization to the coherent shift, it's a dimensional reduction.
No.
Speaks.
No, it's very, oh, sorry, matrix factorizations with zero superpotential are coherent sheaves. That's what I mean. And once stability imposed is imposed, there's a slight reduction in being able to set G to 1. So once stability is imposed, the critical locus plus stability forces G to be 1. That's the reduction. It also forces mu to be 0. And without stability, you wouldn't necessarily have these at the same time. With stability, they both have to be true, and then I've removed the G factor. Okay, so now I can identify these objects. We call them LK for line operator. So LK is what it ends up being is the kth antisymmetric power of the tautological bundle on Hilbert C. But why is that a natural? Well, so we know this is the right thing from Rozansky and Ablankov. How do we know it shows up here? Well, again, there's some physics lore about quantizing a space of M2 branes on a P1 in the conifold that land you with kth antisymmetric products of a fundamental representation of the gauge group sitting on these M2 branes. And so the way this actually comes about is that it's the, like in the G-equivariant category, it's the structure sheaf on G equals 1. Just tensored with the kth antisymmetric power of Cn. This is the direct contribution of the M2 branes. On the A side, the A category was in the version I'll describe here was proposed by Hilbert and Yu. Looks like B modules. Well, it looks like the Fukaya category of the loop space of the 3D target. But algebraically, a version that was proposed is D modules on the loop space of V mod G. And we mentioned this is a braided tensor category. The identity line, or the identity object is L0. In both of these, here it's just the structure sheet. On the Hilbert scheme, here the identity is the structure sheaf of the arc space inside the loop space, saying that if you don't have a line, then loops can be contracted. And saying that loops can be contracted algebraically is arc space inside loop space. And LK, we will describe on the next board. So I'll tell you what LK is. And again, mathematically, maybe it's something you would have guessed, and something that's known and something Alexei knew. But I find it nice that there's a kind of physics brain construction, in this case, using work of Assel and Gomez, that tells you how the mirror map works and tells you what LK is. So what's LK? LK is the structure sheaf of a certain subspace in here. Call it M mod P, where M so I have loops in V mod G. V, I'll remind you, was GLN Cn. So I'm trying to describe a subspace and saying functions on that treated as a D module are going to be the object in the category. The subspace M is matrices where K of the rows are divisible by Z. And the others are regular. And a vector that's just regular. And there's a group that stabilizes this, which is a pair-hor that where the upper K by K block is divisible by Z. Hope this is maybe the only audience I'll ever speak to where some people are familiar with what I mean by the structure sheaf of the substack as a D module. Maybe not. I'll try to relate to Springer fibers, in fact, quite quickly. So okay, there's the next level up or down in the TQFT is what Z of a point is. Objects in here are boundary conditions. Category. And the expectation from the pictures on the left are that objects in their local boundary conditions. It's what boundary conditions look like on a tiny, tiny, infinitesimally small patch. And on a tiny, tiny patch, the only information we actually have are the positions of the strands of a braid in a little complex plane. And so the expectation is that there are objects in here. Lambda labeled by configuration of endpoints. On C. For generic lambda, they ought to all be isomorphic. The interesting thing is what happens when we look at interfaces between one B lambda and another, keep the same lambda, but at an interface, strands can cross. And the braid group on n strands should be represented in the monoidal category of dimorphisms. One of these objects.
Do you really want to think of that as a like discrete transition?
No, so well, when we again, so in physics we vary parameters. In the B model that's described algebraically, those end up being things like resolution parameters, and algebraic geometry, those are varied discretely. In the A side, no, they don't need to be varied discretely. Everything's topological there, and we can just consider deforming the boundary condition as we go around the circle. There's always a limit to be taken where you make sure that all the braid moves happen instantaneously and then get a braid representation. So this was described by that was not a great idea. This braid representation and that endomorphism category was described by Blomqvist and Rosansky. I think given time, I'm not going to say too much about it. I'm happy to talk more after lunch to anyone who's still around.
Just say it's like Professor Kovnikov, Risch, or.
On the B side, first, the two category associated to a point is an equivariant version of the two category that Kapustin, Rosansky, and Salina defined some time ago. This particular object is labeled by T star flag, and the parameters lambda are resolution parameters they're Kähler parameters inside T star flag. Endomorphisms of this. So like all of the interesting information about the knot and the resolution is lying on the boundary. It has nothing to do with the bulk Hilbert scheme or the bulk gauge theory. Here, that information is inside some T star flag. And endomorphisms of this in the KRS2 category, like matrix factorizations on two copies a P star flag because we have two of these, one on each side of an interface. GLN and stuff in the bulk. G equivariant with a superpotential that just takes the two moment maps and contracts them with the coordinate x on GLN. And then this can be simplified and manipulated. It's a monoidal category with convolution, and there's a grade group representation here that's used to produce that. We'll finish on time. Right. How, if you know a braid group representation in endomorphisms of this object in a two category, how do you actually extract not homology, or how do you extract a vector space associated to the disk? In abstract TQFT terms, that uses some relations between the category associated to a point and the category associated to a circle. D of S1, the category of lines is the Hochschild cohomology. Ought to be the Hochschild cohomology of Z of a point. That can be thought of as, so Hochschild cohomology is derived center. That statement is saying that given a bunch of interfaces on the boundary, which are the morphisms in Z of a point, if we can move them across each other, if they're central, then they ought to come from a line in the bulk. And the line in the bulk is the element of Z of S1. Then there's a second map mathematically that's some categorified Chern character that takes us from an object B and an endomorphism M in Z of a point. To an object in Z of S1 to a bulk line. And the Chern character is a trace functor. I'm saying this poorly, and you want to either cut me off or say something.
To say this thing's going to land in the homology. It's just in this case they're not very different.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes. Sorry, it's this. No, it's a map from Hochschild homology that in particular sends an object endomorphism to that. Maybe I'm using some extra dualizations. Yeah.
When you use this term in Cn, the Cn is not involved in the potential as far as I see.
No, not at all. It's not doing anything there. So the upshot is that given an object, our boundary condition labeled by lambda, and a morphism, say a braid, between that object and itself, can sort of put this on a circle, get something that looks more like this. Here's the braid all squashed to a point between B lambda and itself. The physics picture I always have in mind is of inverting the cylinder and sort of a solid cylinder, I'll flatten it and then turn it inside out. to get sort of 3D theory on the outside with a tiny cylinder missing. And that looks like a line. And that's the trend functor that I'm using. And I think the inversions are the dualities that Justin was pointing out. Churn of B lambda beta is the line operator corresponding to this wrapped boundary condition with the data of a braid. And computing the vector space associated to a disk with an extra defect running through, okay, amounts to computing a morphism between this object, amounts to computing hom between that object and LK in Z of S1. Z of S1 in the B twist is sheaves on the Hilbert scheme. It's coherent sheaves on the Hilbert scheme. And this churn character object is a sheaf on the Hilbert scheme constructed from the data of a braid closure. And so everything in the Oblomka-Perzhansky category factors through that. And Gorski, Rasmussen, Negut use circle factorizations to circle bimodules to compute the same sheaves on the Hilbert scheme. Last thing I will say, in the A twist on the mirror side, the boundary condition B lambda is extremely simple. It does not involve a giant flag manifold. Physically, we call it a Dirichlet boundary condition. It trivializes the gauge bundle. A twist. B lambda. It trivializes the G bundle at the boundary, and it sets X GLN to be a diagonal matrix with eigenvalues lambda. And there's some elements in C to the N that gets to anything that has trivial stabilizer energy. Then one can try, right, so one can try to extract a category, a monoidal one category that has a braid group representation. And we have guesses for how to do that. They're not correct right now. Defining this two category and endomorphisms in it and braid group actions is sort of at the forefront of current research on this 3D A twist. So Justin and Ben Gamage and Aaron Mazelji, in the case of abelian theories, have a description of this two category involving Purpose-Strobers. In non-abelian theories, we don't know. I would want something like something from Kaya-E on path spaces. Anyway, for algebraic knots, which is what I had said half an hour ago. For the nice thing about algebraic knots is that the image of the Chern character map is easy to guess. So for an algebraic link, meaning that the braid closure is defined. It's not the way it's usually stated. I think is equivalent. Scaling assumption. The braid closure is defined by taking an element in GLN Laurent series. And restricting to the unit circle. Actually doing this requires some assumptions about rescaling. And as we sweep around the unit circle, the eigenvalues of this matrix sweep out a braid. That was my initial picture of what height braids should look like. At any point along the circle, we have n points in C. Then the churn character of B lambda with this braid attached in the A twist. Ends up being, so this is an object in modules B of K mod G of K. And it's a structure sheaf D module, skyscraper D, sorry, it's a skyscraper D module. At a point gamma 1, where gamma is gamma. And there's a vector in Cn that's 1. And then the computation of a morphism between this churn character and LK. I told you what LK was on a previous board. This now boils down A twist to a morphism space in this category of D modules, which gets computed as Borel-Moore homology of some intersection of supports of two spaces, and that intersection of supports is the affine Springer fiber. So what's generalized affine Springer fiber looks like this. Its matrices G and G of K, such that G gamma, G inverse. I'll just do the case, the bottom row case, where L is the identity line. So this has to be regular. And G times a vector of 1s. So Cn above. Mod G. That's the generalized Springer fiber I'm talking about. So that was the output of the construction by former student Nick Garner and Oscar Keenan, then proved that this generalized affine Springer fiber was the same thing as a Hilbert scheme of the plane curve singularity associated to this matrix gamma, and that connected directly to old work of Blockhoff and company, and not homology. Sorry, so I haven't told you about the unknown interesting things in the A twist, but that might have been a long rambly discussion anyway. Thanks for bearing with me.